So sometimes chaos results in some good outcome. So all of the challenges and the concerns about unionization, World War I developed what they called the National War Labor Board, which enabled peaceful resolutions for labor disputes during wartime emergencies. Again, so once we had a model for how it could be done, it made it easier for the NLRB to write legislation to say, look, we can look back, we did it here, there's no reason why we couldn't do it now in the future regarding, setting this up. So even though it was disbanded, it set the tone, it set the standard for what would be expected later under the National Labor Relations Act and the board that was set up under the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Board. During the New Deal, there was the National Industrial Recovery Act. It put businesses in charge of regulating prices and production and establishing a minimum wage. It gave workers more collective bargaining rights. Even though it was declared unconstitutional in 1935, the good news is later on in 1935, the Wagner Act was passed, learning some good lessons, obviously, from what worked or didn't work before. So after his stuff was struck down, FDR got frustrated and he started to assign Supreme Court justices that basically followed his idea about interstate commerce. Supreme Court gets the message and they broaden the scope of what is considered to be interstate commerce, and labor is a big part of interstate commerce. So the idea that you could strike down the law, that changed, and he was able to then put together some New Deal legislation, which included the Fair Labor Standards Act, which again we'll deal with in the next chapter, but primarily that enabled him to then pass the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act. That Wagner Act guaranteed the right to organize, as we said, established the NLRB as the agency that oversees unions, and talked about unfair labor practices that management engages in. And remember, as I said, Taft-Hartley tried to balance that out a little bit because there was so much emphasis on what management shouldn't do and what was constraining them from being able to do what they wanted to do. And they really weren't focusing on, having a sort of a fair and balanced, if you will, approach to this. So the good news is but the law passed, and that was the watershed event, right? We needed to have that pass, and no law, as we know, is perfect. It is modified, is adapted, and additional laws can be passed to fix the wrongs or the gaps that exist within laws, and that's pretty much what we're looking at here. In that, the Wagner Act was revolutionary for its time, but it had some limitations, and we needed to dig in deeper to try to do something a little bit more and start to then hold labor unions accountable for bad behaviors as well. This has then resulted in basically the height of unionization. Between the 40s and the 50s and into the early 60s, we started to see unions flourishing, growing in leaps and bounds. The pendulum had sort of shifted from it being a bad thing to something that workers craved because it gave them the opportunity to be able to advocate for themselves. It gave them a good balance of power, sort of recovered some of the power they had lost once the agrarian society had subsided and the focus was far more on, industrial labor and the robber barons of the late 1800s. The Taft-Hartley Act in 1948 was a pro-management response to the Wagner Act. It talked about union unfair labor practices to create symmetry, as I said. The goal here was we needed balance. We needed balance between what was considered appropriate before to what is considered appropriate now. It created a thing called the right to work states. And what that means is the right to work states argues you don't have to join a union if you don't want to, but the union can organize, but you don't have to necessarily be a member. You can pay non-member fees to, maintenance of membership or whatever it is. So, or not at all for that matter, to still get the benefits of being in a union. They also called for an 80-day cooling off period when there are some major strikes, so the president can intervene, call for an 80-day cooling off period, enabling both sides to get back to work, to start talking, to get back to the negotiating table, and then continuing forward if they need to. The Landrum-Griffin Act of '59 was looking now at the internal workings of unions and how to manage the union corruption that was growing, and that's linked to organized crime. Shock of shocks, the big joke about Jimmy Hoffa being buried somewhere under Giant Stadium in New Jersey is probably not unwarranted. Organized crime was very big, influencing and controlling labor, and so Landrum-Griffin was attempting to try to manage that influence in some way, to make sure that the unions were doing what they were supposed to do in representing and protecting the workers. In the 1970s, we started to see a decrease in private sector unionization, and this could be for a whole host of different reasons. Obviously, unionized industries were declining. There was much more automation in manufacturing environments requiring less labor, less people. That doesn't mean that the penetration wasn't there, but the numbers were decreasing because there was less of a need for bodies and more of a need for technology to do some of the work. There were a lot of aggressive anti-union campaigns by employers, which was also a big issue. And then union concessions were made during some downturns in the economies in the 70s and in the 80s. And really the one that killed it was in the 80s later with Ronald Reagan, which we'll get into, I'm sure. International competition, globalization, right? As we know, after World War II, the United States was the only game in town, right? Nobody else was a manufacturing behemoth like the United States was. And because the war had destroyed Germany and a lot of the manufacturing that had occurred in Germany and in Great Britain and in some other parts of Europe, and Japan wasn't on the international market. It had a very insular attitude before World War II, and that was World War II was sort of there influencing and having an impact on the global landscape. So we were the only game in town for a long period of time. But as Europe changed, as Europe recovered from the war, as Japan decided to become more of a global player, and they rebuilt, after the war, you found that suddenly there was more manufacturing environments and more countries that were competing out there, and the old way of doing things, having a very expensive labor union out there and not having good quality products necessarily in comparison to Europe and Japan, that became a big issue. Remember, Japan got engaged with total quality management in the 70s. And so the emphasis on quality production started to grow. And the United States took a long time to catch up to that. I mean, we were a follower on this. We were not a leader when it comes to quality management. There were some private sector campaigns that were not successful in organizing people. And so that area in the private sector was slowing down, but we did see public sector growth was booming. Suddenly, we were allowed to, in the 60s, we were allowed to organize government workers. And so the public sector union started to grow tremendously. They're still a very important part of our workforce. I think 11% of our workers are considered unionized. I am considered unionized because I am a part of a teachers union here at SIUE. There is a 20% median pay advantage in union environments over non-union environments. So that's something to take note of. Unions do result in greater pay, even though there are fees attached. But even taking that into account, there's still a higher amount of money that's made in a unionized environment than a non-unionized environment. Even if you're not a member of the union, there's spillover effects that occur, right? So the union workers get a pay increase commensurately. Everybody else gets a pay increase to go along with that. So the union representation out there does deter management abuses. But it's also important to know, one of the reasons why I think there's some shrinking too that has occurred is we've done enough research. We in the management field, we've done research and we've been telling employers for a long time, this is what works and this is what you need to do to make sure your workers are productive, that they're happy, that they're satisfied with their job, that they are getting paid properly. And when you do all these things, the workers won't need to turn to a union to be organized. And lo and behold, you see a lot of employers that take that into account. But labor unions still play an important role. They do hold managers accountable for bad behaviors. And workers don't turn to unions, unless there's a problem, a serious problem attached to it. So if we find that there's a serious problem, then the employer is taking a risk of having a third party come in and intervene with the management of the daily operations of their business. So I would always recommend to any employer, your best example of union avoidance is not illegally to try to strong arm your employees, but to actually treat them fairly, give them good pay, to do the things that we need to do. And I don't think it's any surprise that the decrease in unionization and the increase in the gap between the working wages and the cost of living shouldn't be a surprise at all, right? As unions decreased, workers are less likely to negotiate their own wages in a proper way that make them competitive. And we see employers out there that are making hand over fist money and not paying their employees what they could be and should be doing. So this is an interesting, we're at an interesting crossroad here, I think, as we think about what's happened after the pandemic, and a lot of people are refusing to go back to work and doing the kind of work that they did before, which was very gut-wrenching, hard labor, and abusive labor in many respects for some places. I know my daughter has complained on numerous occasions about the way employers have treated her. So I get it. And I'm just doing the best I can here as a management professor trying to teach these people how to do it right. So here we get into a little bit more detail on the statutes themselves. The Norris LaGuardia Act was passed in 1932. It endorsed the collective bargaining process, didn't necessarily require it. It restricted the use of injunctions in workplace disputes, which means that you couldn't have a court-ordered injunction to stop a strike. It authorized a union strike fund so that when workers were off duty, that they could tap into that strike fund to pay bills and things like that. Because when you're on strike, you're not getting paid. It voided yellow dog contracts, basically meaning that you could not require an employee to sign a contract that says they were not in a union and would never join one. It broadened antitrust immunity, right, and also paved the way for the Wagner Act that happened 3 years later. So the Norris LaGuardia Act was that first intermediate step towards full recognition of unions and legislating their right to exist and to do collective bargaining. Remember, the difference between this and Wagner Act is that it endorsed collective bargaining, but it didn't require it. And so it was a good intermediate step to get people used to the idea of the legitimation of unions and enabling them then to get used to some of the workplace practices, eventually working their way up to that Wagner Act 3 years later. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 again established the right of union members, employees, to work in a concerted action. And what we mean by a concerted action is they work in concert with each other together to form a union, to bargain collectively, so with one voice, and enabling them to strike. It established the National Labor Relations Board, which administers and enforces the act. It hears cases, and it can provide judicial review on what the board orders. The National Labor Relations Act also started to define what management unfair labor practices were. Remember, as we said, it was Landrum Griffin, no, sorry, the Taft-Hartley that addressed labor unfair labor practices, not management side unfair labor practices. Right now, the NLRA was really focused on empowering the unions, and so it wasn't considering sort of that balanced approach as we talked about. So unfair labor practices are considered to be interfering with, restraining, or coercing employees in the exercise of their rights, interfering with the formation of a labor union, discriminating in hiring or tenure of employees, or discouraging membership in labor unions, labor organizations, retaliating for filing charges or testifying under the Act, refusing to bargain with the duly elected representative of the employees. And again, as we said, that the union unfair labor practices, the labor side unfair labor practices, were addressed later on with later legislation.